In this video, I want to talk about the structures of the brain that we can see on our various brain models. First of all, I want to show that the brain is divided into the cerebrum, the main large part of the brain, and then here on this model we can see the cerebellum, which literally means little brain. We will also talk somewhat about the brainstem, but we'll see most of the brainstem on another model. The cerebrum, if we ignore the cerebellum now and look just at the cerebrum, to me it looks a little bit like a mitten or a boxing glove, with the main glove here, the back of the glove, and then a thumb. That thumb is separated from the remainder of this mitten or boxing glove by what is called the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus. The thumb represents the temporal lobe of our cerebrum. Now the cerebrum is divided into 5 lobes, but we can only see 4 of those lobes on this model. So the temporal lobe inferior to that lateral sulcus. Now coming from the midline of the brain and traveling down to the lateral sulcus, we will see what is known as the central sulcus. The central sulcus. Above the lateral sulcus and anterior to the central sulcus, we have the area known as the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe. Posterior to the central sulcus, we have the area known as the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe only extends to about right here, where there's a small notch on the brain called the parieto-occipital notch. Now I know where that notch is because on a midline view of the brain there will be another anatomical landmark there. But for now we'll just go with this notch and draw an imaginary line down at about this angle. So this would represent the parietal lobe of our brain. So far we have the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe of the brain. And we notice the parietal lobe stopped when we got to the parieto-occipital notch. From that imaginary line on back we have the occipital lobe of the brain. The occipital lobe of the brain is mainly specialized for visual information. And then remember, below the cerebrum, we have the area known as the cerebellum, or the little brain. Now if we notice, the cerebrum is thrown into many folds. The raised areas of the folds are called a gyrus, gyri plural, and the indents or the depressed areas are known as a sulcus, or sulci for plural. So we've learned the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus. Now what I want to do is take a look at the midline of this brain and talk about it a little bit more, and then we'll look at some inferior structures. So if we take the brain and divide it down the midline, we can see that these gyri and sulcus also go down into the middle portion of the brain. There is a longitudinal fissure of the brain. I have to put the 2 halves of the brain back together to show you the longitudinal fissure. A fissure is deeper than a sulcus. If you look at the brain from an anterior-posterior view, this is the longitudinal fissure of the brain. Now the longitudinal fissure does not go all the way down. It only goes down through the major features of the cerebrum. So if I remove half of the brain, and we can depict what's going on in this particular instance, the longitudinal fissure goes down to this structure here. This white structure is known as the corpus callosum. It is a large collection of commissural fibers that connect the left side of the brain to the right side of the brain. Immediately above that corpus callosum is a gyrus known as the cingulate gyrus, and immediately above that is the cingulate sulcus, which divides the cingulate gyrus from the remainder of this cerebrum. Where the central sulcus came over the top of the brain, there is an area known as the paracentral lobule. The paracentral lobule. If we were to follow that laterally, we would find that it leads to the central sulcus on the lateral aspect of the brain. What I want to focus on now in this model is the structures associated with the diencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the pons of the brain. We've already talked about the corpus callosum, a large collection of commissural fibers. On a midline structure of the brain, right below the corpus callosum, there's a very thin septum which separates the 2 lateral ventricles. That is known as the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum. And then we see a band of connective, or not connective tissue, a band of neuronal tissue here known as the fornix. They'll talk about fornix in lecture. It is near the bottom of the septum pellucidum. Below the fornix, we can see only a small portion of a much larger structure known as the thalamus of the brain. The thalamus is a relay center for incoming information in the brain. Now notice on this thalamus, right here in the middle, they have a darker dot. The right thalamus and the left thalamus are connected by a very small piece of tissue known as the massa intermedia. Some books just call it the intermediate mass. So when we section this brain in half, we cut through the massa intermedia here of this thalamus. Now immediately below and anterior to the thalamus, we have a smooth area, almost like an inverted triangle, known as the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will lead down to the pituitary, the infundibulum, and the pituitary. Unfortunately, on this brain, the pituitary and the infundibulum have been broken off. Now, if I follow the corpus callosum anteriorly as it comes down and starts to swing back, right at the base of where this corpus callosum and the fornix appear to meet on the model, we have a small area here known as the anterior commissure. The anterior commissure is also commissural fibers connecting the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. This area surrounding the thalamus is the third ventricle of the brain. But keep in mind, the third ventricle was fluid-filled and right on midline. So when we cut this in half and opened it up, we lost all our fluid. So here is third ventricle. The thalamus is the lateral wall of that third ventricle. If we follow the thalamus back, we see a little pink area back here. This pink area here is known as the pineal body. The pineal body. Some books refer to it as the pineal gland. And the blue tissue above that pineal body is called the choroid plexus. This is some of the substance that will make the cerebrospinal fluid. Choroid plexus produces cerebrospinal fluid, and here we find some of it in the third ventricle. It's also found in the lateral ventricles and in the fourth ventricles. Immediately inferior to that pineal body, we see a small area here known as the posterior commissure. So here we have the anterior commissure, here we have the posterior commissure. The posterior commissure is found at the very most proximal portion of the duct that connects our third ventricle to our fourth ventricle. That is known as the cerebral aqueduct, or the aqueduct of Sylvius. So our posterior commissure, right at the beginning of that cerebral aqueduct. Immediately below that, we see two small white lumps here, and on the other side of the brain, two small white lumps. Together, those are known as the corpora quadrigemini. Now, quad means four. Two lumps on one side, two on the other. That's four. The corpora quadrigemini. The top two are known as the superior colliculus. The bottom two are known as the inferior colliculus. Together, they make up the corpora quadrigemini. Then as we pass down posterior to the fourth ventricle of the brain, I see the area known as the cerebellum. It literally means the little brain. Now the cerebellum is associated with coordinating our motor movements so we can have fine motor control, and it also takes care of what is called motor memory. The cerebellum also has gyri and sulci on it, but we're not going to focus on those in this particular lesson. But notice, inside this cerebellum, we have these white fibers that appear like branches of a bush or branches of a tree. Those are the fiber tracts. Not the nerve cell bodies, but the fiber tracts within the cerebellum. And in the cerebellum, we call that pattern the arbor vitae, which literally translates to the tree of life. Now, if we go right up above the cerebellum, I want to point out something we couldn't see on the lateral aspect of the brain. Remember, we had a parieto-occipital notch on the lateral aspect of the brain, and I knew where it was because on a medial aspect of the brain, there is a parieto-occipital sulcus that leads from that notch down toward the cerebellum. So there's a very good fine dividing line here between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe because of this parieto-occipital sulcus. So here was my parietal lobe, here is my occipital sulcus, or occipital lobe with the parieto-occipital sulcus. Also notice, within the occipital lobe, there is a sulcus that runs in an anterior-posterior direction. This is called the calcarine sulcus. Some books call it the calcarine fissure, but in my opinion it doesn't make the definition of a fissure. It is not deep enough. So the calcarine sulcus. If we put the two sections of the brain back together, we'll be able to see the brain stem in a little bit more complete fashion. Here in a bisected portion we can see the area known as the pons and then the medulla oblongata. I'm going to turn that in an anterior position, and again we can see the pons and the medulla oblongata, and if we look carefully in here we can see the cerebral peduncles. Now what I want to do on the rest of this brain is put the two sides together and take a look at the cranial nerves as we did on the brainstem model, or as you can do if you go to the video on the brainstem model, and we can add one cranial nerve that we didn't see on the brainstem model. We have 12 cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, cannot be found on the brainstem model because it does not arise from the brainstem. So here is cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve. Here we see cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve. That is visual information from the eyes, so that has been cut here. And then if we look below cranial nerve 2, we should be able to see the infundibulum and the pituitary gland. They have been removed on this model accidentally by the students, but that's okay because it allows us to see further in. There are two small white lumps here that would have been hidden by that pituitary gland, and those are called the mammillary bodies. Mammillary bodies. They are associated with cranial nerve 1. They are a relay center for smell, the sense of smell. Then on either side of midline, where the cerebral peduncles and the pons meet, we can see, and it's very hard to see on this model, so I'm going to remove this side so we can look inside. We can see cranial nerve number 3, the oculomotor nerve. Oculomotor nerve. And then on this model we see it fairly well. It looks like a little piece of wire, a little white paper clip. This is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve arises from the posterior aspect of the brainstem and comes around to the anterior side of the brainstem. So cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve. Let's put the brain back together and continue. On the lateral aspect of the pons, we see cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 5 is known as the trigeminal nerve. We'll talk about it more in the brainstem video. Then at the junction between the pons and the medulla oblongata, on either side of midline, we can see cranial nerve number 6, our abducens nerve. Then we move laterally, we can see right next to each other cranial nerve 7 and cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve 7, the more medial of the two, is the facial nerve, and cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Some books refer to it as the auditory nerve. Then when we move down into the medulla oblongata, on a lateral aspect of the medulla oblongata, we can see a pink area on this model known as the olive. The olive. We're going to use that olive as a landmark because the olive is going to separate cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11 from cranial nerve 12. On this model, it's fairly hard to make out cranial nerve 11. We have cranial nerve 9, we have cranial nerve 10, and then this lowest portion right here is cranial nerve 11. But notice they are all posterior to this olive. The only cranial nerve on the medulla oblongata that is anterior to the olive is right here. This is cranial nerve number 12. So a quick recap. The cerebrum, divided into 5 lobes, but only 4 can be seen on this brain. Below the lateral sulcus, the temporal lobe of the brain. Coming down from midline, joining the lateral sulcus, we will see the central sulcus. Above the lateral sulcus, anterior to the central sulcus, is the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe of the brain houses primarily motor portions of the brain. Posterior to the central sulcus, but anterior to the parieto-occipital notch, and on the midline view, the parieto-occipital sulcus, is the parietal lobe of the brain, primarily sensory. And then posterior to the parieto-occipital notch and parieto-occipital sulcus is the occipital lobe of the brain. It is sensory for vision. Now, if we could on this model pull the temporal lobe down, we would see that there are some gyri and sulci traveling in and out of the plane of this video on top of that temporal lobe. That is known as the insular lobe of the brain. We cannot see the insular lobe on this model. Two last concepts I want to put in before we end this video. Immediately in front of the central sulcus, we have a gyrus known as the precentral gyrus. That precentral gyrus is also known as the primary motor cortex. That's a big hint that this frontal lobe is dedicated mostly to motor, because our precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. Immediately posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. And the postcentral gyrus is known as our primary somatosensory cortex. Some books just call it the primary sensory cortex. So those are the major features that you should know on our brain models.